Hello, my name's Nadine Tilbury. I'm the Policy Officer for the Working Together with Parents Network. I'm a non-practicing solicitor and my background includes local authority solicitor, private practice solicitor, litigation, family and crime in particular, and then a long stint civil service working in the family justice sector and the criminal justice sector, in particular on issues such as the criminal family system interface and child witnesses and victims and disabled witnesses and victims. And when is learning disability or difficulty usually assessed? Well, we already know what the outcome will be, but we'll do the assessment anyway. So spoke a judge, regretfully. This clearly shows that this assessment was being discussed at a courtroom stage, which is a pretty late stage in the proceedings. And it was being said, regretfully, by the judge, because so much time had already passed before this case had got into court and was being looked at, and an assessment was being ordered, that the outcome did seem fairly inevitable. The timing and type of assessments is something that family court practitioners working with cases involving parents with learning disabilities should be aware of. The first and foremost assessment that ought to be put in place is the one that can establish effective two-way communication with the parent. Because from day one, if there isn't effective two-way communication with the parent, that's a wasted day, a wasted week, a wasted month. The type of assessments are many. There's a SALT, there's a speech and language therapist. There's the OT, the occupational therapist. There's a Care Act assessment. There are cognitive assessments. And all of these should be being conducted before the specialist parenting capacity assessment, such as, for example, PAMS or Parent Assess, QBAS, Learning Curve, Sign of Safety, etc. The timing of the assessment should be calculated to ensure that the parent will have sufficient time to receive appropriate support, process the new information, acquire and practice applying new skills and knowledge. And that should all be happening well before any pre-proceeding stage is reached, let alone the case is already in court. The suitability of the assessor, well, you feel it should go without saying, but I'm rather pleased to see that it is in fact stated explicitly under the Care Act. In Regulation 5 of the Care and Support Assessment Regulations, it requires the assessor to have the skills, knowledge and competence to carry out the assessment in question and be appropriately trained. Now, if an assessment has not been carried out by a suitably qualified and experienced assessor, what value can and should that assessment have? And this is particularly and increasingly important these days with the restriction on applying for experts to give evidence in the family court. For perfectly good reasons, there's a restriction. But more and more reliance is being put on a social worker to be that expert, giving these assessments of parenting capacity in respect to a parent with learning disabilities. So it really can't be too much to ask that the social worker in question is able to say what qualifications, experience, training they've had on the subject of parents with learning disabilities. It is still, to me, slightly surprising that I read a published court judgment in which the social worker giving evidence says that they have never heard of the good practice guidance on working with parents with a learning disability. They have never had any training, but they have worked with many parents with learning disabilities. To me, this is as frightening as hiring an electrician who comes to your house and says, yeah, love, I've never had any training, I've never got any qualifications, but I've worked on loads of electricals. I use a light-hearted comparison, but actually there are potentially quite serious life-changing consequences to an inappropriate person carrying out an assessment, just as there is an inappropriate person carrying out electrical work. The ability to probe and examine specialist parenting assessments is essential. I mean, these assessments are the keystone upon which decisions are made about the children. It's therefore essential that one understands how that particular assessment framework was designed to be used and how in fact it has been used in the current case. Some common specialist parenting assessment tools with which people may be familiar: Parent Assess, PAMS, QBUS, PAMS cartoon. People may be familiar with it or not. On the whole, there are about 25-ish PAMS cartoons that are shown to a parent in pretty much what amounts to exam conditions. They're timed, they're under pressure, they think that if they fail, they'll lose their child. And they may be right, this may be one element of such a loss. But they are asked, for example, for this cartoon, they'll be asked, if you were a parent, what issues would you be looking for here? What would you be doing? And for each issue the parent correctly identifies, they get a point. But there's one issue, if they fail to identify that, they fail that whole section. Now, if you have a look at this cartoon, it's quite busy. There's a lot going on there. And there's one thing that has to be noticed. And that happens to be, how do you dispose of a car battery? These are assessment questions, all apart from one are from PAMS. For example, what are the signs of sepsis? How do you use a checkbook? How do you change a fuse? How do you make a shepherd's pie? How do you calculate interest? Who wrote Hamlet isn't a PAMS question, but it was an assessment question where the young woman who had been swotting up on what to do if the baby had a temperature, how to know if the child was unwell, what steps to take. She was asked who wrote Hamlet. Other questions in PAMS include telephone skills, and that includes two questions. One is, what is the number for direct inquiries? And there's a question about hoax phone calls. So there are practitioners who prefer to move away from PAMS because for them, they feel that a lot of the questions are not particularly relevant in this day and age or to certain cultures. Parent Assess. This is a quick picture of an outcomes table and a quality assured standard mark. It's very visual. The whole system of Parent Assess is very visual. I strongly recommend, for anybody who's not familiar with Parent Assess, signing up for one of the free Parent Assess legal workshops in which the founder, Sarah Lowe, discusses exactly what the framework is based on, how it's designed to work and why, and how practically every piece of paper they produce, every report, every guidance for completion is available for inspection by lawyers, because Parent Assess want people to understand how the system works and to make sure it is used properly. They also have a quality assured stamp, which can only be applied to a Parent Assess report if all the key requirements of the Parent Assess framework have been applied and carried out. Looking at the red, amber, green system, which people are pretty familiar with, PAMS has a red, amber, green and blue system. Often when we ask practitioners about what they understand by that, they're pretty clear about the red and the amber. And then as far as they're concerned, green means no concerns and blue they're not sure about. In fact, with PAMS, blue means there are no concerns. Green means that there are concerns, but low level. Now, if anybody listening to this has fallen into that trap themselves, now is as good a time as any to think about having a look in a PAMS instruction booklet to understand fully why and how a PAMS is conducted in the way it is, why and how the algorithms that the PAMS system is based on work. QBUS is another option, a specialist parenting assessment. Again, it's quite computer algorithm based, but again, definitely worth looking into. Whichever of the three systems a person chooses to use or the report appears in front of you, the crucial thing is to know how the framework was designed to work so that you can check whether in fact it was applied in that way as intended. Some things that can be noted, for example, obviously we would like to have qualified assessors for any of the assessments carried out of any type, as I've mentioned before, and it really has to be done at the earliest stage of the state's involvement with the family, especially if the work or the sport or the training is to have any chance at all of being effective, and if the family's legal rights are to be respected. Any assessment that purports to be PAMS, QBAS or Parent Assess based or styled is not a properly conducted assessment, and therefore its conclusions must be viewed accordingly. PAMS is required to be applied in a particular way. Some PAMS assessors do make adjustments, but this will result in inconsistent application of the framework. So anybody making decisions based on that report does need to be clear about what has been adjusted and why, and therefore what the consequences of the adjustment are. Wherever data creates an auto-generated report based on an algorithm, there must be additional caution exercised about any adjustments to the designed system. Obviously, most of a report will naturally be based on an assessor's subjective interpretation. But again, that makes it even more important to understand how that evidence was amassed. What questions were asked, what tools were used, what behaviours were observed in order to reach the conclusions given. How was the observation carried out? How often? For how long? By whom? Delaying assessments until the court stage will almost inevitably result in pressure for an abridged timescale, which is going to undermine the validity of the assessment. Loads of questions that can be asked. In particular, you would like to know what the questions were that enabled a person to reach conclusions. But I think my first and predominant question would always be, what training, qualifications or experience do you have in working with parents with learning disabilities? And go from there. Here are some more questions that you can go through at your leisure to have a little look at. But again, there's some fairly crucial ones. How much time did the assessor actually spend with the parent? And how was that time spent? What efforts were made to help and support the parent to develop their knowledge and skills? How was the parent enabled to participate in the assessment? And ultimately, is there in fact sufficient evidence to support the analysis and recommendations? Things to think about. How good is your understanding of what is asked of a parent, whether it's for a PAMS or a Parent Assess or a QBAS? And if you don't know what's asked, how can you be sure the assessment was fair and the bar has not been set higher for the parent? How confident are you in interpreting PAMS tables? And if you're not fully confident, how has this affected your understanding of the assessment outcome and your ability to question the assessor effectively? And which parts of the assessment process would you be happy for assessors to leave out completely or to abridge? Some of the assessment systems like PAMS designed for a 12-week. If it's cut to 6 or 8 weeks, something is being left out. And what is it? Thank you.